Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Summer Lopez, and I'm the Chief Program Officer for Free Expression at PEN America, an organization whose mission is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate the power of the written word and champion the freedom to write. This is our 18th PEN World Voices Festival, and since 2005, the festival has stayed true to its original mission, to celebrate the power of storytelling and literature in translation, and to convene global voices across borders, language, and culture. Over the last years, PEN America has tracked an alarming rise in book bans across the United States, and our Freedom to Write Index has tracked the cases of over 300 writers who were detained or imprisoned around the world for their writing or exercising their freedom of expression in 2022. Now is the time to be louder together and to defend the freedom to write, read, and speak at home and around the globe. And this week, we're honoring the power of literature and celebrating the stories that illuminate and interrogate what divides us and help us imagine new futures. For those of you who are new to PEN America, we are a member-driven organization. We have members in every US state and chapter cities across the country, from Detroit to Tulsa and from Birmingham to Miami. We welcome all of you to help us bring our mission to life, and you can check your program for more information on how to join PEN America as a member. We want to thank our members today and our bookstore partner, the Strand Bookstore, for helping us share our authors' wonderful work with you. And I also want to share special thanks to the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, the Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Amazon Literary Partnership for their invaluable support of our work. Now, I'm especially pleased to introduce today's event, Objectivity in the Era of Polarity, and our speakers, Jelani Cobb, Margaret Sullivan, Robert Costa, Wesley Lowery, and Suzanne Nossel, for a timely conversation on journalistic objectivity, critiques of the field, and its continued relevance. Jelani Cobb is Dean of Columbia Journalism School and a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's the author and editor of several books, most recently, The Matter of Black Lives, Writings from The New Yorker. Margaret Sullivan is a groundbreaking journalist and award-winning media critic. She was the first woman public editor at the New York Times. She was a columnist for the Washington Post and is now at the Guardian US. She's the author of Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy, and the upcoming Newsroom Confidential, Lessons and Worries from an Ink-Stained Life. Robert Costa is the chief election and campaign correspondent for CBS News, where he covers national politics and American democracy. He previously served as a national political reporter at the Washington Post and as moderator and managing editor of Washington Week on PBS. And he is the co-author with Bob Woodward of Peril. Wesley Lowery is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, and on-air correspondent. He currently works as a contributing editor at the Marshall Project and a journalist in residence at the CUNY Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. He's the author of the upcoming American White Lash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress. And our moderator for today is Suzanne Nossel, PEN America CEO and author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Thank you all for coming today, and to our guests for agreeing to be part of this wonderful event. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Nossel. Delighted to be here. Can you hear me? No, you cannot. Okay. It's on now? Okay. Okay. Great. Well, it's great to be here. In the interest of at least one definition of objectivity focuses on identifying your own subjectivities and looking at the ways in which you approach a topic. And so I'll identify, to begin with, just a couple of mine as the moderator. First of all, I have to confess, my husband, David Greenberg, who's a historian at Rutgers, wrote a big piece on objectivity. Yes, I am. I had to disclose. Yes, I know. That probably changes everything.
David is a great guy. Her husband is a great guy.
He would have been good on this panel, but that would have been another problem, nepotism. So he wrote a piece on objectivity in journalism that came out last year in the journal Liberty. So this has been a big topic of discussion. And just two other things that kind of, for me, one subject I know we'll get to today is representativity. And that's something at PEN America that we think about a lot and that I think is relevant kind of in the context of this Penn World Voices Festival, which this event forms part of. At the festival, I remember years ago, we used to count up on each of our panels, sort of, what was the racial breakdown, what was the gender breakdown, who was here, who might be excluded. And then we hired, and she's in the back of the room taking a photo, we hired Clarice Razaz Sharif, who's our senior director of literary programs, who now runs the festival. And I sort of just was thinking about the fact that we've stopped doing that counting, because I think for the time being, not that we can't have blind spots, we don't really need to do that counting in the same way. Clarice came from the Schomburg Institute for Black Culture, and for her, representativity is it's just the way that she programs, and it's endemic. And so I have learned very personally and directly kind of what it means to have an organization and leadership that approaches things in that way. So with those two elements of disclosure up front, I want to get started here with what I think makes this conversation so timely, which is that I think we all have that feeling of when you've been on a roller coaster and then it kind of comes down to the bottom and you have a minute to breathe, and then you suddenly feel it's being jerked back uphill. And I think a lot of us had that feeling this week with CNN's town hall with Donald Trump, and this sense that all these burning questions about how the media confronts Trump are now right back in front of us. And what I struggle with is, with all the debate and all the conversation with these brilliant people and so many others, have we really learned anything? Have we really figured anything out? Are we really any smarter than we were, when we began with this 7 or 8 years ago when Trump first became a political figure? So who wants to start? Margaret does.
So yeah, I'd like to talk about this because I've been thinking about this, and these people are all smarter than I am, so I know I can talk about this, and maybe nothing else. I think that the question, have we learned anything, I concluded this week that was a meaningless question, because I don't think there's not only no effort to learn anything, it runs counter to what much of the media is motivated by. So to learn something about covering Donald Trump means you don't give him a platform, you don't let him lie, you don't put misrepresentations in headlines. But there are all these things that are pushing against that, which are, financial pressures for ratings, the effort to take things down the middle, which you somehow think is where the audience is. And so have we learned anything would suggest that you're moving toward a goal, but that's a goal that people don't really want to have.
What? A fan back there. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
What about others? I mean, do you think? I mean, he's running. He's the Republican forerunner. We're once again at this point where
we're 18 months out.
We're 18 months out, nonetheless. Is this a story that the press should be ignoring or looking the other way on? Jelani?
The press, there's one of the kind of false dichotomies that was presented when Anderson Cooper did that speech that he gave, was the presumption that there were only two ways, that unless you were engaging him in a friendly environment with his core voters, his core demographic, and allowing him to run roughshod over your anchor, then the only alternative to that was to bury your head in the sand. And
the silo, right?
Right, the silo. And that flat out wasn't true. There were all sorts of options available. If you felt the need 18 months out to have a forum with this person, which I don't think was necessary, there was no urgency that compelled this. There was no development other than the fact that a jury found him civilly liable for sexually abusing a woman. And aside from that, this was apropos of nothing. But if you are going to engage that person, you don't have to do it live. You do not have to do it, certainly do not have to do it in front of an audience. And you don't have to broadcast it in an uninterrupted fashion in which you don't point out the things that he says that are completely untrue. CNN, for all of the respect that it has garnered, and even the coverage that it did of Ukraine, which has been outstanding, I don't know that how many years of good work it takes to counterbalance the fact that you allowed a man who has been found liable for sexually abusing a woman to then ridicule that woman on your airwaves.
Had been found liable of defaming her too, in addition
Defaming,
to the abuse,
right.
to defamation. And you said, you know what we should do the next night? Bring him on our air to defame her again.
And have people applaud.
Like literally created a platform for, and we always use platform, I mean, literally say, you have just been convicted of defaming someone who you harmed. Come on live television and do it again.
Well, let me bring Bob in here. Yeah, because it seems to me there were two really pronounced sort of reactions to this town hall. On the one hand, it was the people seemed sort of galvanized and energized by seeing Trump again, and that audience in the room, which was terrifying. On the other hand, there was also a lot of people who I think had almost a red alert and a wake-up call and a energized sense that, all right, we're, harrowing as it is, we're in this again and we've got to get going, and a impetus to action. But I'm curious what you think. I mean, is it, about the decision to air the town hall and the way that it was done?
On January 5th, 2021, I was outside the Willard Hotel in Washington, and I was reporting on what was an effort to stop the certification of Joe Biden's election. And I remember passing Proud Boys in the street and Oath Keepers wearing fatigues, MAGA hats, inside the Willard Hotel, Steve Bannon, Rudy Giuliani, plotting to overturn the election. And on that night, it was so surreal in Washington. There was an air of violence in the air. But my failure as a reporter was to not have political imagination about what was possible. It never entered my mind that an insurrection was going to happen the next day in Washington, D.C., because it seemed impossible. And I think the challenge for political reporting now, including the CNN town hall, is that we're mired in a debate over how to handle certain political moments now. But my real view is that January 6th remains an open wound in American democracy that has not been addressed or healed in any way, and there has not been a reckoning for those directly involved with trying to overthrow an American election. And I believe the press needs to actually do more to cover not just Trump, but Trump and the movements he has spawned. The rise of Christian nationalism, if you listen to right-wing media outlets, is one of the biggest stories in America, I believe, rarely covered, coupled with white supremacy, coupled with all these different movements that are conspiratorial, like the Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign, laughed at. It reminds me of 2015. Have you followed his campaign? He's drawn an enormous amount of support for now, maybe 15, 20%. But people laughed at Trump in 2015. They're laughing at Robert Kennedy Jr. The press, in my view, has to do more to vigorously question those running. I think Jelani makes a good point. Live television has real limits about how you can contain someone in an editorial way with integrity. But I actually think more conversations, more interviews, maybe just with a black background like the old Charlie Rose PBS show, for accountability conversations, people need to be put on the record. I think the intent of the CNN town hall had a real value. Trump needs to be put on the record about some of the big questions of our time, including the war in Ukraine. What is going to happen if Trump wins power again? Will he accept a peaceful transfer of power? He made it clear in the CNN town hall that he would only accept that kind of thing if he thinks it's fair. So that was a major acknowledgement from Trump that something like January 6th is very possible again. So hearing it from Trump and from others like him is vital, but doing it in a way that keeps the audience and the reader in a respectful, credible relationship with the press is very important. Because if we lose our reputations as the people who are credible truth tellers, who can really speak to power in a way that's effective, if we lose that, then we lose the audience. And if we can't hold the audience about the things we're reporting, there's a real cost to American democracy.
Well, can I just jump in with one thing?
Sure.
My greatest professional asset as it relates to this subject matter is the fact that my father had a third-grade education. The reason I say that is that my father had a third-grade education because he was born in a place during a time where Black people were not allowed to go past the third grade. All of his siblings had roughly that amount of education as well. We grew up understanding the precise vulnerabilities and limits of American democracy. Now, that is a vantage point that we see increasingly difficult to access because books about Jim Crow and information about the failures of American democracy are being banned left and right in this country. But the point of understanding that, the point of approaching American democracy from the vantage point of its vulnerabilities is that you understand what can undermine it again in the future. As I tell my students all the time, teams watch their game tape to see what they got wrong, not what they got right. You have never seen a coach pull his team together, show them the previous game and say, look at that pass, it's just beautiful. It's because you're actually worried about the things that you are vulnerable to. When we have approached this as an institution from the default presumption that American democracy is impregnable, that American democracy is fundamentally sound, that we've been a democracy since 1776 as opposed to 1965, like when you start with all of those presumptions, it leaves you uniquely and poorly suited to understand the nature of the jeopardy that we confront at this exact moment. And I think that is like, that's key. I think we have to begin by acknowledging that we haven't been a democracy for very long. And that is, when we approach it from that place, we're less likely to make the kind of mistakes of imagination that Bob was just talking about.
Okay, but here's my question. What is the implication of that for where Bob ended, which was a call for credible, fact-based, respected journalism that can be a source of truth amid a roiling sea and be a trusted intermediary to help people interpret and understand the nefarious forces that we confront? Because that's contested territory about whether
it's
that kind of journalism.
But it's not contested territory. It's not when you go back and read the arguments that entire generations of critics of American democracy have pointed out. Like, for one, the idea that democracy didn't exist in this country. Like, you can't have a democracy and still sell people. You can't have a democracy and still have the majority of your people unable to vote. You can't have a democracy, like, just look at this and say, it's not contested because the majority of the Black population in this country has always lived in the South. The majority of that population could not vote before 1965, which means we don't know what really the outcome of the 1964 election should have looked like, or the 1960 election, or the 1956 election, or the 1952 election, or for that matter, that no senator from any state in the South was accountable to, if you were in Mississippi, you were not accountable to the majority of your electorate. Or in Louisiana, you're not accountable to 40% of your electorate because they can't vote. Meaning we don't know what legislation would have been passed based upon the popular will. And so when we go through all of these things, there's a real danger for boxers who go into the ring believing the hype about how great they are. Those are boxers who usually end the fight with a real good view of the ceiling lights. The same holds true for societies and democracies, that your biggest concern should be your shortcomings. And so when we approach it, I think Bob is exactly right. But I think that the route that we take to that kind of journalism, to that kind of perspective, goes through where our failings have been. I've talked about my father. I could very well talk about our anti-immigration. We could very well talk about the denial of the ballot to women. All of those things that we no longer want to talk about, but that are key to our understanding of how we grapple with this particular crisis.
Right. Well, what I want to hone in is what that means for journalism, and whether this panel agrees, in terms of what the implications are of an understanding like that for journalism and how we go about journalism in this moment? You know,
I just want to respond quickly. I think Jelani's making a really powerful point. I don't think we do enough, and I would start with myself, to fully address systemic American failures historically, culturally, politically, economically, racially at the outset of our journalism as a foundation for whatever news gathering we're going to do on the current issue of the moment. I think the challenge is if you have 15 minutes with a presidential candidate, let's say you're in Iowa, the balance between addressing systemic failures in the United States, which are very real and every major political leader should be grappling with, let's say, the news of the day, I think is a real challenge because news organizations often want news of the day. Sure. But to your point, which is very important, to really serve the audience and the mission of journalism, you can't just hover in the news of the day. You have to go deeper, and that's how you truly earn credibility.
I think it's both of those things.
Margaret,
yeah.
you've run a newsroom, so you've had to confront those dilemmas. How do you think these responsibilities can be shouldered?
Well, I think a lot has to do with leadership of news organizations, and that it often flows from the top. What are we here for? You know, are we here to shore up our finances? Are we here to serve the public? Or what are we here for? And you know, I'm not suggesting that when I ran a newsroom I did that tremendously well or anything like that, but I've come to understand that when you have someone who says, here's what we're about and here's how we're going to do it, it's really powerful. And I think we need to see more of that and hear more of it from newsroom leaders at really big news organizations. Like, we have a public mission, and our public mission has nothing to do with enhancing our traffic or our clicks or our profitability.
Is that realistic?
Why not? I mean, you can care about more than one thing at once. And you can care about being, you know, making a profit, and you can still think that you have a fundamental duty to do journalism that serves the public. And I mean, I absolutely don't think, even though Chris Licht, the head of CNN, came out afterwards and said this thing we did was wonderful for serving the public, I don't think that's what it was about at all. I think it was about generating audience, period.
Is there a moment you can point to or a leader you can point to that you think comes close to embodying that? Or
not in this group, I can't. No, that's not true. I work
not the present company excluded.
No. I said that because several of us here worked for the Washington Post, and some of us had our issues with the leadership there, Wesley in particular. But you can talk though.
I'm enjoying
but I think that you know, Marty Barron, who was the editor pretty much the whole time when I was there, did do that well. Did it very well. I don't think Marty was a perfect leader or anything like that, but I admired the fact that when you worked for him, you knew what this outfit was trying to do. And it's not that hard to do, you know. You do it in your actions, you do it in your words, you do it in the kinds of stories that you cover, etc.
Wesley, do you?
Bob also worked at the Post.
Yeah. I'm curious how you guys look at it.
Just a few. I mean, I think we have historically weak journalistic leadership in this moment. I do not believe the leadership of American journalism is in any way poised for the.
People here.
I can talk louder. All right. The problem is I get going and then I don't stop, and so I think we have historically weak leadership in American journalism. I think we have very often cowardly leadership in American journalism in this moment, right now, and I think we're uniquely ill-equipped for what we are currently going through and what we are about to go through. I also think that there is. You know, it's interesting. We didn't do a pre-call in part because we all kind of know each other, right? And I I actually think I probably have the closest relationships with each, like all the way across, right?
Talked about this. That's not true.
No? I'm getting fact checked already, right?
But one of my children is named after Margaret.
Fair enough.
You win.
But I say that to say it's interesting because I really do think that the folks on this panel are extremely smart and thoughtful, and I think that too often our industry institutional leadership is not particularly thoughtful. What we saw this week was not a thoughtful way to use an hour explaining Donald Trump and informing the public. If given 1 hour and an audience of 3 million people, what experts would have sat down and said, this is the way to do this?
No one.
No one. Literally, no one on this panel would have done that way. Please give Bob Costa an hour with Trump. Please give Jelani Cobb an hour.
I would
with
love
Trump.
that.
Right? I mean, but I mean that. But I mean that, right? No expert practitioner given the task inform the American electorate in May 2023 about this historic demagogue political figure and his movement would have chosen to use this time that way. And I think we make, and frankly, I think the thing we do that undermines our credibility, even worse than doing that nonsense in the first place, is our circling of the wagons. This heroic performance and what else could, it's like our job. And then Anderson, I'll be honest, because you work in this field long enough and you know, I wanted to be a journalist since I was 10 or 11. And so there are only a handful of people who I still would use the word admire for, right? In part because you just kind of meet everybody and now that's just a person, right? You know, like it's, you know, like you admire their work or, you know, I think I said this in a group chat, Jelani and I was so deeply disappointed. Mm. And I mean, like, I was sad that the person who I had turned to as a child to find out how much of New Orleans was underwater was like looking me in the eye and just like gaslighting the shit out of me, just lying. Our job as journalists is to survey the facts and then communicate a fair, good faith reading of those facts. And if the leading anchor of CNN lies to me about what the criticism of CNN is, how do I trust them about anything? If the leading political reporter of the New York Times, at a time when a former New York Times reporter, current Journal reporter is literally in Russian captivity, uses their platform to declare that it's heroic to allow a racist attack on a police officer and not respond, how am I to trust anything that person ever writes, ever again? Ever. We debase ourselves when we defend bad journalism. And that's not that, it's not a personal animus. It's not, it's a difficult assignment. But what's also true is that, yeah, and so, you know what I'm not gonna agree to do? That thing that cannot be done well. I'm never gonna use that time that way because it's a trap, because it's a setup for failure. And if I choose to do that, when the stakes are this high, I deserve any and all of the feedback that I receive on it. And again, I think as an institution that relies on trust, we're behaving like police unions. No, there's no way that cop did anything bad. Well, we watch how that erodes trust. Our job is to uphold the standards in our industry. And when someone doesn't do something well, that doesn't mean we attack them personally or we don't care about them as humans or that we ostracize, but it is our job to tell the truth, first and foremost. And what we've seen is a lot of our industry, a lot of the most powerful people in our industry, blatantly lying about what happened. And what could harm the public's trust in us more than that?
Well, I guess here's something that occurs to me listening to this, which is, you know, we've had so much debate over the role of the press. In the meantime, the perception of the press and the influence of the press seems to steadily diminish. In the sense, at least there's a hardened core of whether it's 35 or 40% of America that does not credit, I don't think, any of the outlets that the folks on this panel write for, and that is lost to mainstream fact-based journalism. How do we move forward into what we know is a pivotal moment for our democracy and the fate of our democracy, recognizing look, it's flawed. We haven't remedied a lot of these flaws. But at the same time, if the main message or primary message is sort of attacking the press and calling attention to all of the shortcomings, we will feed into this spiraling of the role of the credible media and a sort of free for all that we've already seen is very dangerous. So how do we, what's the responsible approach, going into the next 18 months in light of that?
I mean, one of the things that happened after 2016 was that the press said publicly and sort of fessed up that the journalists hadn't understood the tenor of the country. And so the answer to that was the wrong answer, I think, which was to, and this is like, said too much, but, to run around to diners and coffee shops in Ohio and to talk to the same people about, do you really still like Trump? Yes. And that was, and that was, our effort to understand the country. But I do think it does come to some extent, it comes down to local news, which I wrote about in this book. And it's a really core problem because local news is more trusted. Local newspapers are more trusted, and they are able to speak to some extent to their entire communities, but they're also failing and going away. So I think one of the things that, it can't happen overnight, but one of the things that can happen is to try to support and encourage local news, not necessarily ink on paper, but in all of its forms, which could be a digital nonprofit, or it could be a newspaper, it could be a lot of things. But that's one of the ways that we try to understand each other in communities.
I'll take a bit of a bounce off the diner point. Of course, diner goers should not be the main source for any political journalism.
They are not America, those people at diners.
But I actually think, as someone who travels the country for a job, there's value in going to diners or ethnic restaurants or a grocery store, because one of the biggest challenges as a reporter out in the field is that, and this is anecdotal, not based on any data, but one of the biggest challenge I face personally is when I meet people, whether it's in Ohio at a diner or at some kind of market in Southern California or in Texas or another part of the Midwest or the South, because I work for a national news organization, the immediate response to me just saying my name in my news organization is this almost knee-jerk reaction, instant reaction, that I am in some way a condescending person, and that I have come from the elite to ask them a loaded question or to in some way make a judgment on them or preach to them without me saying anything, not even asking a question, just by my name and organization. And then a wall is immediately put up. And that, to me, is a tragedy that has to be actively addressed. Because if the national press, or the press in general, if journalists are perceived as those who are condescending and somehow not there to be journalists and listen and figure out the truth, then we're not going to break through to people. And that doesn't mean we cater to people. But I don't know, I don't have an answer for this. But our reputation, perhaps very unfairly, has been maligned with millions of people. So even if we enter with good faith to tell the truth, to ask valid questions, we're not getting through to people often. I noticed this in 2016. I always tell the story. I would go around to different parts of the country and people would tell me they hate both candidates. And then it would take me 5 or 6 questions for them to say, who are you really supporting? Trump. Because there was a social stigma to tell a Washington Post reporter about their views on Donald Trump.
Or on Hillary Clinton.
How much they either loved or hated her. And so I do worry, though, because even if the press becomes more vigorous, more focused, more attentive to systemic failures and talking about substance, how do we break through to people who immediately put up a wall? And I think the Pulitzer Prizes in recent days have been a real affirmation to me and inspiring that what's the way to break through? Give people information they crave that shows people in power whether it's the LA Times report or some of the finalists with different documents they found on the Supreme Court or reports on race and racism across this country. The Pulitzer Prizes, yes, they highlight great work, but to me, they're a reminder that journalism at its best brings fresh reporting to people that opens their eyes about what's happening in their country. And nothing else really needs to be said. Let the reporting speak for itself. And when the reporting speaks for itself, it's so singularly powerful that journalism strategies don't even need to be applied because the reporting is so powerful. It brings people into the story.
Well, I have a question about that in terms of how you think about audience, because that's true if the audience, has some measure of openness to reading a story and taking it in. I'm curious how, to the degree that response that you get, that you're just seen as sort of a vessel of condescension, how much of that is to blame on kind of the work and the appearance and the ways that journalism projects, and how much of it is to blame on a systematic campaign of denigration and discrediting of the media for political purposes, which we tracked at Penn. It was very methodical, and you could see exactly where it was going. He was setting out to discredit the election result in 2020. He started in 2016 to tell his followers, don't believe anything you read or hear from these outlets. And it had an enormous effect.
Well, he said
exactly
it.
The desired
He
effect.
overtly said it to Leslie Stahl. You know why I do this? Disparage you people, so that when you write a negative story about me, no one believes it.
But let's also be clear, this isn't about Trump at all. This goes back to Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon. The most consistent Republican political stance for decades has been do not trust the media. There's no issue that more Republicans agree on and have agreed on for decades. Donald Trump didn't
invent it
at all, not even close, right? The Speaker of the House was named Newt Gingrich, and I don't know if we've ever listened to anything he's ever said, but it's been this same nonsense for decades. It was the Watergate backlash, right? You poor Republicans, and they all think Richard Nixon got a poor deal, and that the press just made all this stuff up, and that we all wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein to take down a president, so we were all searching for scandals, and if we recall, right, I think we have to. I think there's a temptation sometimes to make our conversations about one outlier. Right, about like the singularly problematic person. Now,
but he has made it worse, way worse.
Oh, unquestionably. I mean, I'm not disputing that at all, right? But it's not. If only we could go back to 2004,
no.
things would be great, right? Like it would. But
it's bigger than him now. Ron DeSantis, who might be the near front runner if he gets in eventually, he hasn't spoken to a traditional news outlet in 5 years as governor of the state of Florida. Think about that. It's not only a disrespect to the press, it's a total aversion to the press.
100%. Well, but I guess that's my point, right? Is that this is
no, it's not just.
It's not Trump. It's this entire. This is one of the organizing principles of one of the major political parties in our country. But when we think about trust,
the Democrats could be doing better too.
100%. But I think that when I think about this, right? I think about it's like Bob. As I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about. So two things. First is that I remember, I take it really seriously. In the Green Room, we were talking about the rise in Christian nationalism and white supremacy, and it's an intersection of things we both cover. And I remember the day when we were at the Washington Post that Bob covered that Trump was likely to run for president. I literally remember the subtweet from a leading New York Times reporter, well, some news outlets think this person could be the president. I can literally remember watching Bob do this diligent reporting. He's been around the country. He goes, I think we need to pay attention to Trump, and being openly mocked.
Ridiculed.
I mean, truly.
By many.
Right. And what I'll say is that I think that we get into this conversation sometimes, and it's made about principles when the conversation is actually about practices. And so what I mean by that is, right, one of the reasons Bob can say the things he says is because he actually does the work and is around talking to people and has an expertise in how to it is like, one of the reasons Jelani can write what he writes is because he does the research and does the rigor and does the reporting, right? What do we do? I mean, one of the big answers is good work. And we have to be honest about the fact that so much of the journalism we are publishing is not good. Not we, us, but the collective we.
Can I just make a quick point? So often in the press, we talk about the right, and the right deserves enormous amounts of scrutiny. But I think the press needs to step up in its coverage of the left. In 2014, I got to know a United States senator that when I was in the Senate hallways, almost no one spoke to him. And then he and I got to know each other pretty well. We started to talk, and it turns out he wanted to run for president. And no one would even write an article. So I went to the Washington Post and said, in June of 2014, I want to write a story about this senator thinking about running for president. And my editors go, what are you talking about? No one even knows who he is, and he won't run. If he runs, it'll be a fringe campaign. That senator was Bernie Sanders. And I wrote the first story ever in a national newspaper about Bernie Sanders thinking about a presidential campaign in June of 2014. You know who has never forgotten that story? Bernie Sanders. Because I took him seriously as a potential political figure, and that the lack of imagination about what's possible on the left. Bernie Sanders, I think, is more important than almost any other left-wing politician in the last 50 years. He's like the Barry Goldwater of the left. When I first started talking to Sanders, issues like Medicare for All were seen as outsider, fringe, never to happen issues. Now they're at the mainstream of the Democratic Party. But the press doesn't cover the left with the interest and vitality it deserves. And I think that's a real challenge for our journalists, is that the right needs to be covered tough with intense scrutiny, but the left just can't be kind of ignored. It's not just the corporate Democratic side of the party. If you trace Occupy Wall Street to now, the left-wing story is a fascinating one in this country. And we could move into a more authoritarian state in this right-wing group that's running this country, or we could move with the rise of globalization and challenges to a more statist left-wing democratic government. And we need to report that out.
Jelani? I feel like
I agree.
I could feel it brewing up over there.
So I think that on the subject matter of this panel on objectivity and polarization, there's a kind of problem that's implicit within this, and it is that in our capacity as journalists, we very often are called upon to tell people things that they don't want to hear. And the element of trust comes in, that someone who you trust can tell you something that you don't want to hear. But it also is very easy to cynically say, well, the thing that you don't want to hear, that's not true anyway. And so for all the things that Trump did as it related to kind of use of the media, the dominant theme was the cynicism of it. Anything that people did not want to hear was just not true. So while everyone is saying there's this novel virus that seems to be circulating with lightning speed and is causing really serious, he said it didn't exist first, which is if you hear something scary and then they say it doesn't exist, you feel better. And then when he has to concede that it exists, he says, well, it exists, but there are only 15 cases and next week there'll be none. As if that's how math works. And so,
in the summer, the sunlight was gonna.
Sunlight was gonna do all these things. And so, for those of us who were broken up about Frederick Douglass being dead, but it was always the thing that you don't, the thing that you are afraid of doesn't exist, or is false, or is being made up by the media. And so that was a kind of baked in part of it. To Margaret's point about the importance and vitality of local news, and to Bob's point about how people react to us, I think there's another kind of historical element of this which is important to think about, which is, I've always said, Americans have distrusted large, powerful institutions for as long as they have been Americans. If you were in the 19th century, people distrusted the railroad syndicates. In the later 19th century, they started distrusting the banks. And you look at Grapes of Wrath, and when Steinbeck has that amazing paragraph where he talks about how a bank is an entity that's made up of people, but it has to be more than people because it does things that the people themselves would never do. The people who make it up would never do. And so it's like this distillation of how people don't trust large, powerful institutions. As it is now, the media that people interact with most predominantly is media that is based somewhere along a coast. Individuals who have flown into a community, people who you don't have any kind of connection to. There's another element of this, which I talked about with my class. Among the institutions that Americans do trust, small business and the police. Small business makes sense. These are the businesses you interact with on a daily basis. The police thing was confounding because at first I was like, oh, this is just white people, right? Like, white people trust the police. And then I was like, no, there's actually something different here. Because when we think about police, we think about the NYPD, the LAPD, the Chicago PD, any police department that there's a TV show about, that we think about them in those terms. But the fact of the matter is that 50% of the police departments in the United States have fewer than 10 officers. And 90% of the police departments in the United States have fewer than 50. So for the majority of people who are interacting with the police, they are interacting with someone who is, if the person is not familiar to them, they are from their community. So their relationship to policing is incredibly local. And so all of this comes back to the way in which we sponsor, rehabilitate, and help to support the local outlets in which journalism happens, because those are the people who can actually tell you something that you don't want to hear.
Yeah, it makes me think, I just, as you talk about that, I think about human rights work. And when you go to do human rights field work around the world, what is crucial is you have an interpreter or an interlocutor, someone who comes with you. If you're a foreigner, you've got someone who's with you, who's from the local context, who can speak the language. And their role, they're much more than an interpreter. They're a relationship builder with whoever it is you're going to be speaking to. And they provide a kind of comfort level and a kind of cultural bridge, if you will. And I'm curious, we were talking a little bit in the green room about kind of the problem of the interface of national and local news. And, shouldn't we just be sort of handing over the money to strengthen local news? But should there be some more interplay here? Is there some way to leverage local connections to contextualize and get over this rift of sort of the perception of condescension and outsiderdom?
I think that's happening on a small scale. The Marshall Project, which is based in New York City, has partnered very successfully with an outfit called Mississippi Today, which won a Pulitzer this past week. But that kind of thing where there's like a big outfit that has lots of philanthropic or other money, partnering with and helping the small, really small in some cases, startup or legacy news organizations is, it's one piece of the puzzle.
When you look, Jelani would know much more about the history of this, but the history of journalism back in the 50s and 60s, some of the great reporters on the race beat in the 60s, journalism, very generally speaking, was often a working class profession. You didn't even need a college degree. And Watergate in 1972, 3, 4, really, especially with All the President's Men film, it becomes this kind of gathering spot for those in the 70s and 80s and 90s from more elite institutions. And that's a generalization, but you've seen a lot of people with college educations, higher ranked colleges get into this field. And I think journalism, I'm not a newsroom leader, but could do more to hire people from different parts of the country, because it's so easy if you start your career from a top college and you go to be an intern at Politico or at a national news organization to then just be in the pipeline. And I think newsrooms in television, in print, and web could do a much better job at scouring the country for rising talent who are doing accountability stories in different parts of the country, maybe with not the college degree that other people have in the newsroom. Maybe they don't even have a college degree, but they're hungry and they're doing great journalism. And then you can bring people who have real local, I know this happens, especially when people from local organizations win Pulitzer Prizes, they get on the radar, but that radar could be expanded. to bring people into these, because the news is unfortunately becoming very nationally driven versus local for a variety of reasons. And so how can we bring more people with different perspectives, backgrounds, and that includes racial, it includes gender, it includes economic, it includes geographic. And you need to be a really sharp newsroom leader to make sure you have a balance. You're not just trying to hire people from Ohio because they went to Ohio State, but you're hiring people who maybe they have parents who are undocumented and they grew up in Nevada or California, and they can help tell that story or any story, and not necessarily put them on the immigration beat. Let them cover Wall Street, politics. And I think that kind of integration across the board would really be healthy for journalism, because without naming names, I mean, so many newsrooms, it's just, where'd you go to school? Harvard, Yale, Cornell, or I went to, with all respect, Columbia Journalism School.
Which is an outstanding credential, I should add.
It's true.
Can I say?
I'm going to just say, after this, we're going to open it up for questions. So please start thinking about your questions. Go ahead, John.
I had an experience where I was horribly stereotyped. It was like terrible. And it's something I was like expecting to deal with in my career, but never this overtly, where someone on social media, I've been writing at the New Yorker and I've been at the New Yorker, and they just decided that they were going to say this thing to me. And they said that I was an out-of-touch elite New Yorker writer. And I was like, oh my God, that's such a stereotype. It was like, the amazing thing in life is like, this is the stereotype I now have to deal with. But and the other thing I'll say about this is that I think about that in tandem with something else that someone else said. And this is when I was still on Twitter, like a whole other panel conversation. But someone said that, I really like the fact that Jelani Cobb is at the New Yorker. And I've heard that from people before. And, I like assume that it has something to do with me being, a Black person at the New Yorker, although there have been other prominent Black writers at the New Yorker prior to me. But I still hear that from people that, they think is important that I'm there. And they said something that actually caught me off guard. And they said, he gives me hope because he doesn't have an Ivy League degree. And I was like, wow, because many of my colleagues at the New Yorker do, including some of my African-American colleagues, and so not all, and not all of my colleagues are, from the Ivy Leagues. But it was this idea of people wanting to participate in this craft and participate in this profession. And of all the things that I thought about when I first started at the New Yorker, not going to an Ivy League school was like not even in the top 10. If I was anxious about anything, it wasn't that.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I want to open it up to questions, and then I'll come back at the end. But I think there are a couple of mics.
If you have any questions, please
Let's
raise
start
your
with
hand.
just to because it's perfect. The Harvard shirt in the front row.
Great, we'll bring him a mic.
I should disclose
Proudly
that
wearing that.
I was in class with Jelani Cobb about 6 years ago. So, but my
You have a
question.
mask
You're
on, so I
ruining
can
this
actually know
trend.
who
Really hard
this
to
is.
say.
My question is, I'm thinking about people like my parents who live in California, but they have, I would say, had their brains turned to mush by Fox News for the last 25 years. And we haven't really heard anything about Fox. But when I think about them, I think they're kind of hopeless. I don't personally...
Faultless?
No,
Hopeless.
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 25 years of that, I don't think there's kind of stories that they could be told or read or listen to, because they also don't have a media diet that includes other outlets. And I think they're not a small percentage of the population. And so I don't know what to do about these people. I mean, they're my own parents, but my idea in 2016 was I started writing and then deleted an email where I said, I will talk to you after Donald Trump is no longer president, because I just couldn't engage. But I think that's a large percentage of the population, and I don't know how any stories could ever reach them or change their minds.
Right. I mean, the topic of this session is objectivity in an age of polarization. And the polarization is absolutely played out in the media, and Fox represents and influences the whole right word part of that in a pretty profound way. So I'm not sure, when you said your parents are hopeless, did you mean you're hopeless about them or they are hopeless about the country? I was afraid of that. I mean, I think it's a huge factor, and it's a way that we are not able to speak to, with CBS News, the Washington Post, the New York Times, are not really able to get through to people like your parents because they're deep into their bubble. And, I don't know what to do about that, but it's a huge factor in our whole country.
I think, sorry, I think, I'm of some different minds on this question, and I think part of that just might be the things I cover and also my perspective in terms of my own identities, right? Because I really do see reaching people as a secondary goal. And that is not me suggesting that trust doesn't matter at all, but my job is to paint an accurate picture of the world. Not my mirror's job is not to make me feel good, right? It is to show me that I need to go back to the gym, right? And I can get mad at the mirror all I want. The mirror has done its job. And frankly, as a black reporter, if you were to tell me that if you were to go back a generation or two generations, you call up Frederick Douglass or Ida B. Wells and you say 30% of the country isn't going to trust you, they'd be like, only 30%? This is an amazing victory. The idea that Jelani Cobb shows up anywhere in the country and only 3 in 10 people would distrust what we had to say is the most trust a black journalist has ever had in the history of America. And so I think about, and again, none of that is to diminish what I do think is important. We need a public discourse and dialogue and public square that is rooted and based in shared facts and reality. But the reality is that the lack of that has not been created by journalism. It's been created by all of our institutions. I can't go teach everyone how to read or how to do critical thinking or how to, that's actually not my job. My job is to write down what is true. And I think that, and I think one of the reasons I become more hardline on that is because I think when we try to do other things, it only makes everything worse. The thing that is in our control is our journalism rigorous? Have we told the truth? Are we writing it down? The moment we start trying to worry about our marketing, we end up making decisions that severely compromise us. And I actually think harm our trust, right? There's a world where the CEO of CNN believed the thing he did this week was going to help his trust and CNN's trust. Exactly. And seeking to do that, it's, I talk about this in therapy and other places, right? The guys who are trying to be good guys never end up being good guys because they're so in their head about trying to be a good guy. They do a bunch of shitty, inconsiderate things. And I think that very often trying to be perceived as a thing leads us to be thoughtless about what our actual job is. One of the ways to be trusted is to be trustworthy, which means if the sky is blue, you say the sky is blue. If something is racist, you say it is racist.
Okay, we have a number of other questions. Let's go to, on the end there, yes, you've been waiting. Go ahead.
Hi, first, thank you all for having this conversation today. It's really worthwhile. Also, I was the one that clapped at the beginning for Margaret, and I would have clapped for all of you.
I know you were.
But it would have became really awkward. I just want to touch on something that Wesley said earlier about credibility of the press. One thing that I noticed, and I'm sure it's older than this, but I really noticed it coming out of 2016, is that circling of the wagons. And there just seems to be a real insularity to the press when it comes to admitting mistakes. I don't think I'm smarter than anybody that does this for a profession, but I get the sense of behind the scenes when the microphones aren't on, the kind of criticality that we've heard up here goes on, but to the public, we don't see that. And it just seems like in a free society with a First Amendment and a freedom of the press, the only way the press can be improved is to police itself. It can't be the government saying this. As an audience member, I can turn off CNN, but that's, a single man's boycott. That's not going to make a difference. It seems like the only thing that's going to make a difference is the press checking itself and having the courage to say, we got this wrong, not just because we didn't predict who the winner is going to be, but we got this wrong, and how are we going to learn from this and do better? And I just wonder, and I promise there's a question here. Is there some kind of careerism or something that prevents the press from being self-critical? Is it because I don't want to be too critical of the Times, because down the line I'd like to work at the Times? I don't want to be too critical over it. There's something there, because you're smart, intelligent people as a profession, and there's just something that gets missed. At least to me as an audience member, it's like, I know what I'm seeing.
It's a good question. I mean, I can see my panelists leaning in, Margaret and Bob.
So one of the ways that happened for a while was that big news organizations had ombudsmen and public editors, right? And so they were, and I was one of them. So, it
And
was
a great
like,
one.
thank you. We need to do this because we know we're kind of in trouble. I mean, they tended to grow out of scandals, And so, you'd get somebody there who was veteran, as we like to say, old journalist, and let them have an independence and do the job. And I think that that's really useful. And those have almost all gone away, which is, I think part of that circling the wagons thing. And it's so interesting about the circling the wagons. News organizations do it for each other as well, not only for themselves, but they do it for each other. And so I'd like to see that return. I don't think it will, honestly. I think that news leaders and publishers were very happy to get on board with the trend of getting rid of these annoying, meddlesome, what's the priest, troublesome priest. So I don't see it coming back, but I do think it's a way to police ourselves to some extent.
I one time had a discussion with a Trump advisor about Trump calling the media fake news. And it was explained to me by this source and by a few others that the intent of this was to have the press be put on the defensive and then be talking about itself. In other words, by saying you're fake news, Trump and others like him who use that phrase want the press immediately to do the human response, which is, wait a minute, I'm not. I'm real news. And what's the press doing when it's doing that? It's talking about itself. And opponents of the press want often to bait the press into conversations about the press because it distracts from the actual mission of journalism and of reporting on people in power. I have a MO of not weighing into, of course, I understand the hypocrisy. I'm here on a journalism panel. But
we twisted your arm.
But, yeah, they did. But to say less about journalism, fellow journalists' performance, because I think it's the audience's, we're in a rough business. This is a public-facing business, and we deserve to be knocked around if people don't like what we're doing. But it doesn't serve for me to jump into any media debate on Twitter with any kind of strong opinion. Really, to me, this is just my personal decision, is meaningless, because the more journalists are talking about themselves, it's narcissistic. It's not even careerist. It's we're talking about ourselves. And I think to come back to my point about condescension in terms of the perception of the audience, the more we talk about ourselves, the more we fuel the idea that we are obsessed with ourselves. Even if we're having legitimate journalistic debates, I think there's the
term I've heard for that process is that we are a self-licking ice cream cone.
Definitely more visual.
Okay, in the front row here, the blue, and then
One more question this
okay,
afternoon.
yeah. Can we do sneaking? I feel bad for the back.
We
row
can
there.
do two more. How about
Okay,
that?
so front row and the back row. Yeah, I know.
Sorry, thanks. I'll try to keep this brief. This has been fascinating. Thank you. When hearing about all this, I wonder how much of this is something that the journalists themselves can control and how much of it comes from a consensus of ownership. Because in a way, it doesn't seem like Bezos and Zaslav and people like that have that much that are different, even if their news agencies would try to tell us that they are not Fox News. When you actually look at their politics and their ultimate kind of viewpoints and where they want the economy and regulation and those sorts of things to go, they're probably fairly similar to Murdoch. But it seems like journalists are the ones beating themselves up when there may be forces above them that kind of control and restrict what they can and can't do. And I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
I think that there are a couple things about that. One is that we've never had a kind of ideal system for journalism, for funding journalism. And predominantly, even in the kind of what we think of as golden eras of newspapers, they were owned by a single wealthy family, or a company that had an interest in it. And that's why we think so much about the separation of church and state, which is obviously a very imperfect system. But in theory, your business interests are supposed to be very different than, what your editorial outlook is. In other instances, we've talked about nonprofits. We were talking about nonprofits, which depend upon philanthropy, which is by definition voluntary. There are, and then there's the idea around kind of state sponsorship or kind of like what kind of public models that you have, which you've also seen, politicians attempt to pressure media outlets in that way. I think that there aren't any perfect models for it. What you are dependent upon is the independence of an editor-in-chief, who in turn is going to deflect, the criticism or stand as a barrier between those individuals, those forces, and their reporters who are on their staff. All of this is highly imperfect in the ways I just pointed out, and many other ways that I haven't talked about, but that is the system that we have, for better or worse.
In the back, thank you.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the conversation. I'll also out myself and say that I'm also from Columbia Journalism School.
Yay, thank you.
And I think my question is to Jelani, based on everything that we've talked about today. I think of, the pressures that we're dealing with and everything, but what do we tell our student journalists then? I speak to a lot of early career journalists who are in grad schools or, going through journalism programs, and they need jobs. They have to listen to their editors and their leaderships. It's nice to have ideals. Yes, you should, do good journalism. That's what we're all here for. But what do we tell them?
I tell my students all the time, very honestly, about the landscape. I don't have to talk about the landscape. We're pretty much familiar with what it looks like out there. But I've always said that every single day that we wake up, there's someone doing important journalism. For all of the criticisms and all the malaise and woe, we still provide an indispensable service. And if anyone has been in my class, they've heard me say the kind of thing that doctors are really important, engineers are really important, lawyers and nurses are important, social workers are important, EMTs, a whole array of people who are important. The Constitution says nothing about any of them. The Constitution sanctions one profession, and that is ours. And so the work that we do really is valuable and important. And if I'm honest, I derive a great deal of my optimism from the people who are entering my class. I think that it goes as much in that direction from the class to the person in the front as it could possibly go from the person in the front out to the class.
Real quick, I would encourage them to demand opportunities to report once they enter the industry. I think what really bothers me about people in their 20s is that they opt out of journalism after 2 to 5, 6 years, because so often the hiring opportunities, the entryways into journalism today, especially at top organizations, is to be something like the social media editor, or to be kind of an associate assistant producer, where by the time you hit 25, 26, 27, you're still stuck in this kind of corporate behemoth where you're not getting an opportunity to report. So demand opportunities to show why you're there, to be a journalist and not just a cog in some kind of content machine.
Okay, we have the inspirational and the very
That's
practical. So a great combination. And I think with that, Summer is going to close us out.
Yes, I just want to say thank you all for being here, and thank you to our panel for such a compelling and insightful conversation. And the Penn World Voices Festival is not over. It continues this afternoon and this evening. You can head over at 3 o'clock to the Church of the Village and hear Marlon James and Ben Okri. You can be right back here at 4 o'clock for a conversation on what AI will do to literature. And the full lineup is on our website. So thank you, and thanks again to our panel.